There is a belief so deeply embedded in modern society that most people never stop to question it. The belief that debt is temporary. That nations borrow during emergencies, tighten their belts afterward, and eventually return to balance. That deficits are mistakes, not features. That if governments were simply more disciplined, debt would shrink. History shows the opposite. Every major power that entered the modern financial era became indebted. Not briefly, not accidentally, permanently. This is not a coincidence. It is a structural outcome. Today, nearly every government on Earth carries obligations larger than its annual economic output. Some have tried austerity. Others have pursued growth. Some have defaulted. Others have printed. Yet the result converges to the same point. Total debt rises, which forces us to confront an uncomfortable question most political debates carefully avoid. What if debt is not the problem the system is failing to solve? What if debt is the mechanism the system is built around? To understand that, we have to abandon the household analogy entirely. Governments do not operate like families. They do not earn first and spend later. They spend first, then issue promises to cover the difference. And those promises are not just accounting entries. They are assets for someone else. This is where the architecture reveals itself. When a government issues debt, it creates a financial instrument, a bond. That bond is purchased by institutions that did not previously possess the money in physical form. The act of lending itself brings new money into existence. Money does not precede debt. Debt precedes money. This is the foundational inversion of the modern monetary system. Every unit of currency enters circulation because someone, somewhere, promised to pay it back with more than was created. The principle exists. The interest does not. This imbalance is not a flaw. It is the engine. Because if interest were created alongside principle, the system could close. Debts could be settled. Accounts could return to zero. But the system is not designed to close. It is designed to expand. At the macro level, this creates a mathematical necessity. In order for existing debts to be serviced, new debt must be issued. Growth is not encouraged. It is required. The moment expansion slows, stress ripples through the structure. This is why debt crises do not emerge from irresponsibility alone. They emerge when growth decelerates. As long as expansion continues, the system appears stable. Interest is paid. Markets remain confident. Governments roll obligations forward. The future absorbs the pressure. But the pressure never disappears. It accumulates. Over time, interest payments transform from a manageable expense into a permanent claim on national output. Budgets become less about public priorities and more about maintaining credibility with creditors. Policy space narrows, flexibility erodes. This is how debt quietly converts political power into financial obligation. And this is not new. Long before modern currencies, states learned that borrowing was easier than taxation and politically safer than reform. Borrowing delayed pain. It pushed consequences beyond the current generation. For centuries, this strategy worked, until it didn't. Empires that financed expansion through debt found themselves trapped by the same logic. Servicing obligations required more extraction. More extraction weakened productivity. Weaker productivity required more borrowing. The cycle tightened. What distinguishes the modern system is not the presence of debt, but the sophistication of its postponement. Centralized banking, deep bond markets, and globalized finance allow obligations to be extended across decades, even generations. Crises are softened. Collapses are delayed. Reckoning is deferred. But deferral is not resolution. Each intervention compounds the underlying imbalance. When revenues fall short, borrowing fills the gap. When borrowing strains credibility, monetary expansion stabilizes markets. When expansion erodes purchasing power, growth is pursued more aggressively. Every solution feeds the same structure. At no point does the system aim to reduce total debt. It aims to make debt serviceable. This distinction matters, because a system designed to eliminate debt would prioritize closure. A system designed to preserve debt prioritizes continuity. Modern finance chose continuity, which means that escape is not merely difficult, it is structurally discouraged. Any serious attempt to reduce aggregate debt contracts the money supply. Contracting the money supply suppresses economic activity. Suppressed activity reduces revenue. Reduced revenue increases deficits. The moment austerity becomes real, political stability weakens. Social pressure rises. Leaders reverse course, not because they lack courage, but because the system punishes restraint. Not because they lack courage, but because the system punishes restraint. This is why debt grows regardless of ideology. Conservative governments borrow, progressive governments borrow, democracies borrow, authoritarian states borrow. Different rhetoric, same outcome. Debt is not a policy failure shared across governments. It is a policy outcome shared across systems. Over time, the role of the state shifts. It becomes less a steward of collective welfare and more a manager of financial obligations. Long-term planning gives way to short-term stabilization. Structural reform is postponed indefinitely. Future growth is always assumed. But growth itself is finite. Productivity gains slow. Demographics shift. Resource constraints emerge. As expansion becomes harder, the cost of maintaining the illusion rises. This is the inflection point, where debt stops being invisible. Interest consumes larger portions of budgets. Monetary interventions become routine rather than exceptional. Confidence becomes the primary asset holding the structure together, and confidence is fragile. Once markets begin to question sustainability, the system faces a dilemma with no clean exits. Default shatters trust. Austerity fractures society. Monetary expansion erodes credibility. Every path leads to instability, which is why the system prefers delay over decision. Delay stretches decades into what feels like permanence, but mathematically, the trajectory never changes. Debt was never meant to disappear. It was meant to bind the future to the present. And once a society accepts that structure, escape becomes not just unlikely, but incompatible with the system itself. This is not a conspiracy. It is architecture. To understand why the debt system cannot be escaped, we need to see when choice quietly turned into constraint. This did not begin with modern politicians, nor with recent crises. It began when states discovered a method of financing power without immediately confronting their populations. In the early history of nation-states, governments funded themselves primarily through taxation, conquest, or direct extraction. War was expensive, but its cost was visible. Citizens felt it directly. Resistance formed quickly when burdens grew too heavy. Debt changed that relationship. Borrowing allowed rulers to wage war, build infrastructure, and expand influence
without demanding immediate sacrifice. The cost was deferred, pain was postponed, and postponement proved politically irresistible. At first, lending to governments was risky. Defaults were common. Creditors demanded high returns, and only the most powerful states could borrow at scale. That began to change when something critical emerged: permanent public debt. Instead of borrowing for a specific emergency and repaying it afterward, governments began rolling obligations forward indefinitely. Old debts were paid with new debts. The concept of final repayment quietly disappeared. This was the turning point. Once creditors realized governments would not eliminate debt but preserve it, lending transformed from risk into strategy. A permanent stream of interest replaced uncertain repayment. Stability replaced closure. To support this system, institutions evolved. Central banks emerged not simply as monetary authorities, but as stabilizers of sovereign debt markets. Their role was not to eliminate debt, but to ensure it remained serviceable. Liquidity was provided when markets hesitated. Confidence was restored when fear appeared. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Government debt would not be allowed to fail. This assurance changed behavior on both sides. States borrowed more freely, knowing crises would be managed. Financial institutions accumulated sovereign bonds, knowing central authorities stood behind them. Risk migrated away from lenders and onto the system itself. Debt became safer than restraint. Over time, government bonds stopped being treated as obligations and started being treated as foundations. They became collateral, benchmarks, anchors for the entire financial structure. Entire markets were built on the assumption that sovereign debt would always exist, always roll over, always be honored in some form. At this stage, reversal became nearly impossible. Because eliminating debt would no longer affect only the government. It would destabilize banks, pensions, insurers, and global capital flows simultaneously. What began as a fiscal tool had become systemic infrastructure. This is the lock. From this point forward, debt reduction was no longer a technical challenge. It was a structural threat. Every attempt to shrink sovereign debt now risked triggering deflation, asset collapse, and institutional failure. The system learned to respond accordingly. Whenever pressure appeared, intervention followed.
Interest rates were lowered to reduce servicing costs. When that was no longer enough, liquidity was injected. When liquidity threatened inflation, growth was encouraged. When growth slowed, borrowing increased again. Each step preserved stability in the short term while expanding dependency in the long term. This is how debt migrated from policy into architecture. The state was no longer borrowing to fund specific goals. It was borrowing to sustain the system that borrowing itself had created. At the same time, the nature of money changed. Currency became less a representation of value and more a representation of confidence. As long as belief held, expansion could continue. As long as markets trusted the structure, limits appeared distant. But belief is not infinite. As debt grows faster than productive capacity, the system compensates by compressing the future. Longer maturities, lower rates, higher leverage, more assumptions about tomorrow. The future becomes collateral for the present. And this is where the final constraint emerges. Once a society reaches this stage, there are no neutral choices left. Every decision carries systemic consequences. Raising taxes risks economic contraction. Cutting spending risks political instability. Allowing defaults risks financial collapse. Expanding money
risks currency credibility. Each option undermines a different pillar, but none restore balance. This is why reform stalls. Not because leaders are unaware, but because the system punishes resolution. Debt can be managed. It can be restructured. It can be diluted. But it cannot be eliminated without dismantling the structure built upon it. And so the system chooses continuity. Roll forward, stabilize, defer. What appears as control is, in reality, containment. The longer this continues, the more power shifts away from democratic choice and toward systemic necessity. Policy becomes reactive. Leadership becomes custodial. The future is administered rather than shaped. This is not collapse. This is preservation at all costs. And preservation carries its own price. Because systems designed to avoid immediate failure tend to accumulate invisible fragility. Stress is absorbed, not released. Imbalances widen beneath a calm surface until something forces recognition. Which brings us to the present. Because the mechanisms that once stabilized debt have now been stretched to their limits, interest rates can only fall so far. Expansion delivers diminishing returns. Confidence requires increasing intervention. The question is no longer whether the system can reduce debt. It is whether it can continue pretending reduction is unnecessary. History suggests that when systems reach this stage, the final phase does not arrive through policy debate. It arrives through pressure. By the time a system reaches this stage, the debate quietly changes. The question is no longer how to reduce debt. It becomes how to live with it. In the present era, sovereign debt is no longer treated as an abnormal condition. It is assumed, embedded, budgeted for decades in advance. Entire policy frameworks now operate on the expectation that obligations will expand indefinitely. This is where the final transformation occurs. Debt stops being a consequence of policy choices and becomes the environment policy must survive within. Modern governments no longer plan around eliminating obligations. They plan around managing market reactions. Interest rates, bond yields, currency stability, and investor confidence quietly dictate what is politically possible. This is what financial dependency looks like at scale. When debt reaches a certain magnitude, sovereignty becomes conditional, not removed outright, but constrained. Decisions that threaten debt service are treated as systemic risks. Decisions that protect debt holders are framed as responsibility. This inversion is subtle but profound. Public priorities compete with financial credibility, and credibility usually wins. At this stage, central banks move to the center of governance, not because they seek power, but because the system requires a stabilizing force capable of acting without delay, debate, or popular consent. Their mandate expands quietly. Interest rates are adjusted not to optimize growth, but to preserve solvency. Liquidity is injected not to encourage productivity, but to prevent fracture. Asset prices are supported not because they reflect value, but because they anchor confidence. Each intervention solves a short-term problem while deepening long-term dependency. This is the trap. The system cannot tolerate withdrawal of support, yet every layer of support makes withdrawal more dangerous. Debt servicing costs become politically untouchable. Large portions of national budgets are allocated before a single public priority is discussed. The future is pre-committed. And, as obligations compound, flexibility evaporates.
At this point, citizens often sense something is wrong, but struggle to articulate it. Life feels more expensive. Stability feels thinner. Growth feels less rewarding than before. Yet official narratives insist the system is functioning. This disconnect emerges because the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is not optimized for broad prosperity. It is optimized for continuity. As long as debts are serviced, the structure holds. Distributional outcomes are secondary. Long-term resilience is postponed. The present is stabilized at the expense of the future. This is why reform repeatedly fails. Any serious attempt to reduce debt requires contraction. Contraction threatens employment, asset values, and political legitimacy. Leaders respond by reversing course. Every time. Austerity sparks backlash. Defaults trigger panic. Monetary restraint exposes fragility. The system punishes resolution and rewards delay. So delay becomes doctrine. Debt is restructured instead of reduced. Inflation is tolerated instead of collapse. Purchasing power erodes slowly rather than abruptly. The costs are spread thin across time and populations. This is not incompetence. It is risk management within a constrained system. Over time, this process creates a society living inside a permanent holding pattern. Growth is pursued not to advance living standards, but to stay ahead of obligations. Productivity gains are absorbed by servicing costs. Innovation slows as returns are redirected toward stability. The future becomes smaller. And yet, collapse does not arrive suddenly. Not at first. Systems like this rarely fail from a single shock. They fail when confidence erodes just enough that intervention loses credibility. When markets begin to doubt not willingness, but capacity. At that moment, the tools that once preserved stability become signals of weakness. More intervention is required to achieve the same effect. Each action buys less time than the last. Trust decays incrementally. This is why the final phase often feels calm until it isn't. The warning signs are visible only in retrospect. Rising intervention, falling effectiveness, narrowing options, increasing reliance on psychological assurance rather than structural repair. By the time the public recognizes the pattern, the system has already crossed the point where painless exits exist. This is the ultimate irony of the debt system. It does not collapse because people misunderstand it. It endures because people depend on it. Retirements rely on it. Institutions rely on it. Governments rely on it. Any attempt to dismantle it threatens everything built on top of it. So the system persists, not because it is healthy, but because it is embedded. Debt was never meant to be escaped, because escape would require dismantling the structure that organizes modern life. The system does not imprison through force. It binds through necessity. And necessity does not negotiate. The final stage of such systems is not marked by sudden ruin, but by a gradual narrowing of possibility. Fewer choices, more constraints, less room to maneuver. Collapse, when it comes, is not a surprise. It is the moment when confidence finally acknowledges what mathematics has known all along, that a system built on perpetual expansion cannot outgrow its limits forever.